So I'm talking to Charles Ehrhart, and he coordinates the work of CARE International on climate change. Now, you've been involved in the negotiations so far. What sort of level of impact do you think the NGOs are having here at the moment?
The NGOs have not had the kind of impact that we had hoped for. We had been hoping to push for a fair, ambitious, and legally binding agreement coming out of Copenhagen, and at this point in time it looks like we're not going to get any of those outcomes. The propositions that are on the table in terms of emissions reductions are simply not ambitious, which is to say that they're not appropriate. They simply don't reflect the science. They reflect political expediency. And while we are sensitive to the pressures and the difficulties of getting a more ambitious agreement, at the end of the day, you can't negotiate with physics. And so the message from the science is clear, and that's where we need to aim. We're getting nowhere near there at this point. With regards to having a binding deal, well, it's now at this point clear that we're not going to get a legally binding agreement out of this particular set of negotiations. Now, then the question becomes whether or not we're going to get that legally binding agreement either in the next 6 months or over the course of the next year. I certainly hope so, but I think that one of the things that's on the minds of many of us is exactly what do we expect to change in the next 6 months or even 12 months that is going to open up the way to having an actual legally binding agreement then. In other words, if we don't get it here, it's not entirely clear why we should be optimistic that just procrastinating another 6 months or a year is going to make it easier. In fact, there are a number of very specific reasons why we could say that it would probably be even more difficult, in particular dealing with domestic politics and election schedules in some key countries. Yeah?
Yeah. Now, with CARE International's work is related, as you were telling me off camera just a moment ago, very much to floods and flood victims in a number of parts of the world. Would you tell me a bit about that?
Well, so not only is CARE trying to address some of the policy concerns around climate change, but we actually do a great deal of programmatic work. CARE is one of the largest humanitarian NGOs in the world, as well as one of the oldest. And both in terms of our humanitarian response to disasters, what we're seeing is increasing frequency and intensity of some of those disasters. And so that is part of our response to some of the impacts of climate change that we in the communities that we serve are already experiencing. But with regards to water, it's much more than that. I mean, the increase in frequency and intensity of extreme events is part of how water feeds in or fits into this entire climate change crisis. But also we've got to contend with kind of the chronic impacts of climate change, which in many places is or includes just a gradual decrease in precipitation. And this is having implications on aquifers. This is having implications on, for instance, how deep wells need to be dug in parts of the world where people already have limited access to clean, safe water. And when you've got to dig a well deeper in order to account for decreasing water tables, then that also means that it's much more expensive, which means it's all that much more difficult. And one of the things that we're listening to a lot here, which is both interesting and very disturbing, is the governments are saying, well, we anticipate that we just see more and more demands on our money, right? We are hearing about hundreds of billions perhaps being needed to invest in mitigating climate change. We're talking about 100 billion or thereabouts needed for adaptation every year. And that's not even tagging in the amount of money needed for governments to actually live up to their MDG or Millennium Development Goal commitments. So they're saying, all these demands on public finance, and at the same time we're hearing from the economists that the impacts of climate change are going to have negative impacts on our economies, reducing the tax base. So where's it all going to come from?
Financing is a difficult question. We're hearing this everywhere. Now, A few weeks ago, I was discussing with a number of European policy experts about water and Copenhagen, and they were saying that water was essentially off the agenda, and they were very worried about this. Now, your opinion is slightly different. Would you tell me about that?
Okay. Water is being discussed here, and in the following way, it's being discussed much more than it had been in the past, and somehow it seems that a kind of a collective light bulb has gone off, that water, amongst other things, is necessary for agricultural production, and agricultural production is one of the main issues that we're now beginning to talk about here. So it's water, agricultural production, hunger, and then everything spinning off from that. Issues around migration, large-scale migration, issues of national, regional security, stability. So people are talking about water. They're beginning to recognize how important it is. Now, what these others might have been referring to is that you're not seeing much reference to water per se in the negotiation text. But you got to remember that these negotiators, part of what they're trying to do here is pull words out to bring it down to a manageable level. Because what we would hope would come out of these negotiations would be a relatively high-level text that then needs to be interpreted and applied by more technicians, if you will. The windows of opportunity to look at the challenges of adapting water resource infrastructure, etc. Those hooks are here, all right? So the hooks are here, that's good, the opportunities are here. The challenge is going to be to make sure that the technicians are aware of how much work needs to be done within water sectors, broadly speaking, with those adaptation resources.
Wow, that's excellent. Thank you very much for your time. It's very kind to speak to you.